Okay, so our first how-to is how to decarbonise your council with Isaac Beevor. So Isaac started work in the local climate policy in Metro Vancouver, managing volunteers and working on campaigns to support Vancouver's low emission buildings policy and introducing an annual measuring and reporting system across Metro Vancouver. Now, he's the co-director of Climate Emergency UK, where he co-wrote the Climate Action Plan checklist and helped to lead the Council Climate Plan scorecards, and now the Action Scorecards. This is the first UK-wide assessment of local authorities' climate action plans and methods of action. Isaac will be sharing these practical tools with you in his session. So, Isaac, over to you.
Amazing. And thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm really happy to be here today. I've just got some slides for the session, so I'm going to be sharing my screen. I'm just going to do that now. Cool. And it's amazing to speak to such an international crowd as well. Often when you work in the local authority space and council space, you talk to people from across the UK, but it's great to be speaking to people from across the world. Great, so I'm going to start the slideshow. Just let it load. Brilliant. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how to decarbonise your council. Obviously, this will be particularly from a UK perspective, but often from my knowledge of Metro Vancouver and working in the local climate sector there, it's often that city councils across the world are actually taking very similar actions, from decarbonising their homes, instituting better and higher efficient building regulations, to trying to move people towards active travel instead of personal car use. I'll also, and I'll just flick on to the next slide, I'll also be talking a little bit about Climate Emergency UK, obviously who we are, and more about the Council Climate Action Scorecards, which is our project which we are about to launch tomorrow. Hopefully from this you'll understand the importance of council climate action as well, and know some of the top priority actions for councils to take to design the net zero world that we're all trying to move towards. Brilliant. So, Climate Emergency UK, just our ethos and history. We at Climate Emergency UK, we're here to equip the council climate movement with the information and guidance needed for structural change and accelerate the work of local campaigns for climate action. And we really see ourselves as sitting between kind of communities and campaigners and councils, and we've kind of like a foot in both camps, helping to support both, because we need both communities and campaigners to be driving forward action, but also councils to be taking that forward as well. We started about 4 years ago, and we collated the climate emergency declarations from all UK councils in the UK. We then moved on to create the climate action plan checklist, assess all UK councils' climate action plans, which we released in January 2022. What I'm about to talk about a little bit more is the Council Climate Action Scorecards, which, as I've said, is due to be launched tomorrow. So why are local authorities, though, so uniquely placed to decarbonise our communities? So 83% of UK councils have declared a climate emergency since 2019, and we love that political commitment that's been made by UK councils. We also know that the Climate Change Committee has said that local authorities have powers or influence over a third of emissions in their locality, and with actually some estimations putting it far higher. So councils are uniquely placed to drive down emissions within their area. And we also know Chris Skidmore, who wrote the Net Zero Review, pointed out there is plenty of regional, local and community will to act on net zero, but often national governments get in the way. And that's true from my experience in Metro Vancouver, with sometimes the lack of power, the lack of funding, the lack of resource and capacity, which often comes down from national or regional governments, is one of the major problems across the world. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. We're very excited for the launch, which is why I've mentioned it. But the Council Climate Action Scorecards will launch on Wednesday, the 18th of October. And this is a screenshot of what the data will look like. It's not real data. This is taken from our plan scorecards. And in January 2022, we released the plan scorecards, which was the first ever assessment of councils' climate plans. And what we did, we didn't just assess, we assessed not just like the net zero targets, but also whether they covered things like equality and diversity in their plans, whether they're reaching out to communities who are most going to be affected by climate change. We also covered whether they linked the plan to other documents such as the local plan, whether they committed to update their corporate plan, which is their some of their key documents, and whether the governance of their plan in terms of their measuring and reporting was also mentioned as well. All of that information is online at councilclimatescorecards.uk. But tomorrow, and what we are launching the action scorecards, and that is as the first ever UK-wide assessment of council climate action. Just to say a little bit more about the project, it's been a really long 18-month project, which is why we're so excited for tomorrow. So it started off creating the methodology, and this hasn't been done before. So we created the methodology through research and development. Obviously, we talked to over 90 people and organisations across the UK in that 6-month period. And we also had an advisory group that represented the sector, and that included 2 council officers, some councillors, campaigners, former volunteers, and 1 representative from Ashton and the Scottish Improvement Service. So then we launched and published our methodology for the scorecards in November. And then we moved into the actual marking process. And what's unique about the scorecards is it's one of the largest climate citizen data projects that we know of. We'd love to find out if there's stuff that's bigger, but it's one of the largest that we know. The scorecards itself, they come from 3 different main data areas. So one of the ways we collect data is from freedom of information requests, which are legally binding requests that you can send to councils to gather information. And we sent those in January 2023. The other way we get data is from national data, whether that's national campaign organisations such as 20 is Plenty, or which is collates information on the local authorities that have made 20 miles an hour the default speed limit, or the national government data. And the other way we get data is through volunteer research. So 2/3 of our 90 questions are actually covered by volunteer research. And we're always so excited that we have so many volunteers get into what can be quite the unsexy topic of local climate action. And so, in fact, we had over 200 volunteers get involved in the first marking period in February and March this year, which was really incredible. And 15 of those helped process the 4,000 freedom of information requests we sent out to councils, and the other 200 were collating around the 20,000 data points that is the volunteer. That is the questions answered by volunteer research. What's unique about this project as well is we engage councils quite a lot. So we send the councils their first mark with a chance to respond. That's the right of reply period. And this year we had an incredible response rate with 74% of UK councils responding in the right of reply. So almost 3/4 of UK councils actually responding. And that's double the number that responded in the plan scorecards. And then, because we know that having such a large team of people collate the information in the first place and to take into account the right of reply, we go through a scoring audit process. That's with a much smaller team of experienced volunteers, auditors who are retrained, and they award the first mark based on the right of reply, and that first mark. So they award the final mark. And then we're launching the scorecards project tomorrow. So a little bit about our methodology. What's great, again, about the action scorecards is we don't just cover specific areas. We don't just cover the 2 main areas like transport and buildings and heatings, but we cover things like governance and finance. So does the council have an elected member that is responsible for climate change? Have they embedded it in their procurement strategy or their corporate plan, which is one of their main documents? Have they introduced some of these actions into their local plan? Are they approving new solar, wind, or renewable energy developments, or are they also approving, new oil, coal, or gas, which would obviously have a detrimental impact? And we go through, so from buildings and heatings, transport, all the way down to biodiversity and collaboration engagement as well. So we're assessing across every area of the council's function, which is why we're so excited to be releasing this data. We know that So our methodology covers those 7 sections, which has a total of 91 questions. That we know those are actions that councils can take, and we know that if councils were to do all of those actions, that they'd be making good progress towards net zero. We're not obviously able to capture every single action that a council can take, and we know that when councils introduce individual things, they'll have to make it applicable to their area and how their area is and how it works. But we do know that if a council is taking the majority of actions, they'll be making really good progress towards net zero. Cool. I can share some preliminary results with you today, so that's really exciting. These are just the average scores for the different kind of lists that we have across the UK. So in the UK, local government can be a little confusing because we have different types of local government that range across like similar powers. So we have single tier authorities, which is known as like English unitaries, metropolitan districts, Scottish and Welsh councils that broadly have the same powers. Their average score was 35%, and their range was from 9% right up to 62%, with the highest score for single tier. A district council, you then move into the 2-tier authorities, district councils and county councils. So their average score is 29% and 35%, with the range you can see there, again, ranging from around 8 to 61 or 12 to 53%. Northern Ireland, we pull out as a separate list to assess. Because they have a far different range of powers, like far less powers for Northern Ireland districts. And you can see the average score in Northern Ireland is 21%. And then combined authorities, that's the English mayoral authorities as well. And their rate, I'm just going to move that screen. And their average score is 46%, again, ranging from 8 to 65. Yeah, so they're the results shown. You can see that councils are scoring generally low on this area, and we do know that councils need to do more to move towards net zero. And later in the session, I'm going to cover some of those actions they can take. So while councils score low overall, some have scored high in certain sections. So just to reaffirm as well, so only 41 UK councils scored over 50% in the first ever Council Climate Action Scorecards. But some councils were able to score over 80% in certain sections, and that includes buildings and heatings, collaboration engagement, waste reduction, food and planning and land use. And I think there's one council who's actually managed to get a 100% score in one of their sections. So you can see that while councils score low overall, they actually have scored highly within certain sections. So I'm actually going to move on now I'm really sorry, Rimby, I'm really struggling to see like the live chat and stuff. Is there any questions on the scorecards at all that I could maybe take now, or I can move on to the actions? Or
let me have a quick look.
No problem. Thank you.
No questions have come through yet, but
That's
I'll keep
great.
an eye and I'll collate them at the end if any come in.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Yes, so moving on to what actions can councils take, and I'm going to go through this by the different sections that we have. So obviously buildings and heatings, that's the area that is the largest source of emissions within a council's area. And retrofitting homes is obviously the biggest thing that is needed here. UK homes are some of the worst insulated in Europe. And we had an exclusive in the Financial Times, which is there from our FOI responses, that show council homes have a long way to go to being energy efficient. We found that only 48% of councils in England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland that have council homes have more than their council-owned homes with an EPC rating of C or above. So that's only 48% of councils that have their council-owned homes with an EPC rating of C or above. EPC ratings are the energy performance certificates, so the energy efficiency of those homes. And so if you get C or above, it's fairly energy efficient, which means you'll have a warmer home, lower bills for the resident. And to see that only 48% of those councils were able to achieve that at this time shows that there's kind of like a postcode lottery for where council homes are warm and efficient. However, we know that retrofitting homes costs a lot of money, and without adequate levels of funding from the national government, councils can sometimes feel daunted by the scale of the challenge. But there are really important steps that councils can take to support low emission homes locally that doesn't cost as much. So these actions include providing advice to homeowners on how to retrofit. Some councils are setting up specialist advice centres that their residents can call. Supporting homeowners to use renewable energy in their homes through collective buy-in schemes. So that's like having an area-wide buy-in scheme, so the cost of the solar panels is less. and enforcing the minimum energy efficiency standard, which is MEES. In the UK, in England, sorry, we have a minimum energy efficiency standard for housing, and despite its low level or for that standard, councils can enforce that standard and make sure that any homes that are below that standard then meet the requirements. And what we've been able to see is actually not many councils are enforcing that standard yet, and it's really important from from a health perspective, from an equality perspective, and from an emissions perspective that they do. Cool. Moving on to transport. This is a picture from one of my favourite pieces that collated the research that had been done on the actions that councils can take in transport, and basically it came forward that obviously less car use and more public transport, more active travel, more walking and cycling is what is needed to mitigate climate change and adapt to a lower carbon way of living. The picture on this slide is from a research article on the most effective ways to reduce car use and therefore emissions. And you can actually see from 3 of the top 5 actions to take relate to removing free parking. And that is totally within the remit of councils. And while it could be politically difficult to remove free parking in different areas, it's actually one of the most effective ways to discourage short trips taken by cars. So it is one of the lower cost effective actions council can take, and that's to implement like fee paying parking permits, to implement paid parking in, say, car parks across their borough that people use to access businesses. And as I said, it's one of the key actions to disguise short trips by driving, and actively encourages short trips being taken by walking, cycling, public transport. And of course, what councils can then do with the revenue raised from those parking, councils can reinvest that directly in active travel or public transport infrastructure. One of the best schemes that we had in the UK is in Nottingham City Council. Since for the last 10 years, I think just over, Nottingham have had a workplace parking levy, and you can see that's number 5 on this list. And what that does is it introduces paid parking for people at businesses with over 10 parking spots. And over the course of that 10 years, they've seen congestion go down at peak times. They've seen the number of people using public transport go up. And what they've able to do, because they have raised over £90 million, is use that money to reinvest into sustainable transport across the city. And then they've also secured inward investment of over £1 billion in transport. So they've said, like, to the government, to private business and people like that, we're raising £10 million a year or thereabouts. What can you give us so that we can drive forward better action? And at a time when council budgets in the UK for the last decade have been unfairly cut, being able to create revenue that also drives climate action and for climate action is essential. Cool. And this is actually my favorite topic with planning, and it is very related to design. So what actions can councils take in planning and land use? Building a low carbon future is something councils that are planning authorities have the power to do, and it's sometimes, if only the planning inspectorate would actually allow them. So there are some pioneering councils in the UK and actually across the world, including Vancouver, that Bath and North East Somerset, Merton, Cornwall, Central Lincolnshire, that go beyond the UK building regulations in their local plans to push for net zero for operational emissions of new builds. And that makes a huge difference to housing emissions. It means any new build housing is going to be energy efficient, it's going to run on clean energy, and it's therefore going to have a reduction in emissions, but also be better for residents as well. And it also crucially cuts any retrofit bill that we are going to have in the future to make sure our housing stock gets to net zero. The problem is one of the major blockers here is actually the planning inspectorate. So their inconsistent decisions have meant that similar net zero policies for new builds in Lancaster City Council, Greater Manchester Combined Authority and West Oxfordshire are actually currently blocked because the planning inspectorate in certain areas are saying they don't have the power, but actually in Bath and North East Somerset, Central Lincolnshire and Cornwall, they're saying they did have the power. And so we had an article published in the Local Government Chronicle calling that out with the inconsistent climate decisions. I also want to give a shout out to the kind of like overall design that councils can have as well, and especially for 15-minute neighbourhoods or 20-minute communities. The UK government has actually insisted in the last few weeks on peddling conspiracy theories that somehow it's councils trying to lock down people, but it's absolutely not the case. What 15-minute communities are is they're looking at placing the daily needs of residents within a 15-minute walk or cycle. So that could be having grocery shops, schools, your local doctors, anything else that you need to live within a 15-minute walk or cycle. And it creates strong, connected and low emission neighbourhoods. And it's one of the most effective things that councils long-term can do to create a net zero world. Moving swiftly on, I know I'm covering quite a lot in a short amount of time, but I do want to get to some time with questions. What actions can councils take in governance and finance? In this section, we have a lot of questions about whether councils have integrated their net zero targets into the rest of their council work. So put simply, there's no point having a net zero date if none of the council's overall strategies or financial plans put the climate emergency at the heart of them too. This includes their procurement strategy, which many councils have said they will review to take climate action seriously. And one of the key things they can do within procurement is obviously asking the businesses that they buy, asking their suppliers for their climate action plans, and they can ask for what action they've taken to reduce emissions from the business's supply chain or directly. And obviously they can add weight within the procurement process for carbon emissions or biodiversity improvements. And if they take that seriously in the application process, if they take that seriously throughout the scope of the contracts, it's one of the ways that councils can drive a huge change, not just in their area, but potentially across the country and across the world as well. Councils have huge purchasing power in the UK because there are almost 400 of them, and they're each buying, goods and services. And if they implement climate action into their procurement strategies, is one of the ways that they can take the most effective action. So from governing documents to something that's actually very practical and essential for living, food. This is just one example from our waste reduction and food section, but councils do have input, sometimes more directly than others, into school meals. And the example we had is from this section is about reducing meat in school meals. We know that meat consumption is a huge contributor to carbon emissions, and we know in a low carbon world we'll need to eat less meat. And moving towards a plant-based diet can even help move towards food security in the UK. There is national legislation in the UK that requires schools and councils to provide at least 3 meals with meat each week. But that means there's still scope for councils to provide 1 or 2 completely vegetarian days a week in their school meals. And just from our research and looking at campaigns like Pro-Veg, who work with schools to introduce more vegetarian foods, we know that some councils are doing this. And when our scorecards come out tomorrow, you'll be able to see which councils are providing a completely vegetarian day. And the structural impact, again, is huge. And this is just like very rough numbers just to show the scale. But if you were to have 39 weeks, so that'd be 39 completely vegetarian days across 50 schools, with 300 pupils eating them, that's 500,000 meat-free meals just for maybe one particular local authority area. And this can be done by councils requiring their contractors to provide 1 completely vegetarian day a week, or if they still have more control of their schools, working with the council in-house caterers to do so. I've just got a couple of sections left, so biodiversity and then collaboration engagement. Thank you for staying with me. What actions can councils take to improve biodiversity? We're always sorry to pull out when a council's actually quite good scheme goes slightly wrong, but it's a really important point. So sorry for anyone who is joining us from Gloucester or Gloucestershire. But one of the key actors in mitigation and adaptation in biodiversity, but also improving biodiversity, will obviously be increasing forestry cover. In the UK, we're one of the least forested nations in Europe and actually in the world. And increasing tree cover would improve biodiversity, help reduce the urban heat effect, and in some areas it would help mitigate flooding as well. But the conversation has been dominated by how many numbers of trees can be planted, with no thought to how many trees are lost every year, no thought to if the right tree is planted in the right place, and sometimes no thought to aftercare after they've planted them. So it's key that councils don't just have a goal to plant more trees, but actually have a target to increase tree cover. And that's the key thing that's going to drive forward change. So a target like this would include the need to preserve existing tree cover, so existing trees. It would include growing the right trees in the right place, allow for natural regeneration of forests, and have a plan of how to manage and support the trees as they grow over time. So we would love to see councils aiming to double tree cover by 2030, and that would be a really good place to start. And we also can't stress the importance of good tree management, including the watering of newly planted trees, which is crucial to their survival. Unfortunately, climate change is going to make summers hotter and drier in the UK. Well, sometimes actually wetter, but in shorter bursts, and so actually drier periods. So unfortunately, during the heat wave in 2022, one council actually lost 12,000 newly planted trees, which is a double hit of the climate crisis, like already affecting some of the actions that the councils are trying to take, but also exemplifying the need for our climate action to be adjusted to the already changing climate as well. And moving on to collaboration engagement, which is the final section. And obviously this is not such like a practical example of a council taking adaptation or mitigation action, but it's a way of working to carry out all those actions. And it's really important that obviously we bring communities and residents with us on this journey of change to a net zero world. And it's more important than ever that councils engage, consult, and work with residents to implement these changes. So the image on the slide is actually the image that's been adopted by disability activists and campaigners across the UK. And I think is actually really appropriate for how to just generally do good collaboration engagement with communities. So that includes proper consultation, especially with those most affected by those changes and by the impacts of climate change as well. And they must be able to engage with proposed changes and not feel like decisions are being forced upon communities. For example, when taking actions to reduce road pollution, such as implementing a school street, which is a common project across London boroughs, Norfolk County Council and others, you want to ensure that residents of those streets, school children, parents of the local schools involved in any of those proposals, because most people, while they might drive, are also pedestrians and will benefit from cleaner air near schools as well. So if councils are laying out the co-benefits of schemes, if they're laying out, it's a reduction in air quality, a reduction in emissions, it's an improvement in active travel. If they're laying out those co-benefits, but also working closely with communities to consult and engage them, then hopefully we can move faster, but also move equitably to a net zero world. Cool. I know I've covered a real whirlwind of action and things across the UK. I know I didn't have loads of time, but we've got some time for questions as well. Just to reiterate, we have 91 questions which relate to 91 actions that councils can take. Some actions are easier to implement in some councils than others, which is why it's so important for councils to play to their strengths and have a good climate action plan and a strong climate action plan. And we'd love if people are able to use the scorecards, which are going to be launched tomorrow, and the information we provide to work more effectively on these issues. And so, so thanks for listening. Do keep an eye out for the scorecards release, and happy to answer any questions. The one thing I will say, I can't answer any questions about individual council scores because that's secret until the results come out tomorrow. Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Isaac. That was excellent and incredibly informative. I have looked at the Q&A section and we've got a few great questions that have come through. So I'm going to jump right into that. So one great question that's come in is, some actions might have a negative impact on communities, e.g. poorer families who rely on free parking for days out. How do you balance actions to build a low carbon future versus supporting marginalised communities?
Yeah, 100%. So there's definitely things that councils can do that to mitigate against some of that things. So for example, like when ULEZ, the ultra low emission zone was expanded in London, the Mayor Sadiq Khan put forward a scrappage scheme. So anyone that was being affected could, for example, put forward and get money back towards if they wanted to need to buy a new car. In the West Midlands, when they had ultra low emission zone introduced as well in Birmingham. Their scrappage scheme also allowed people to get money towards public transport. So you got like a big amount, I think it was around £1,000 that you could then put forward towards public transport. But actually the key thing here to remember is the poorest people in the UK do not often own cars. In London, in the borough of Lewisham and Southwark, where I am, it's around 50% of people in these areas do not own cars, and often that is correlated with people that do not have the highest income. And so by removing cars and improving public transport, you are directly helping the poorest people. And what you can then do for those that do have cars and need to make the switch or need to change their travel, you can help mitigate some of those actions by implementing schemes such as the one with you. There's like scrappage schemes, so support for people to change their car to a new electric vehicle, or for using it for public transport credits. So yeah, there are definitely actions that councils can take to do that, and it's really important to do that. But on car use, one of the most important things is that often the poorest households don't actually own cars.
Okay, no, that's understandable.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, we'll jump on to the next question. Time's running out. Next one is, as a graphic designer, can I use the climate scorecards on my work or use in a client project, or is it just for councils?
Yeah, we would encourage anyone to use the scorecards however they felt they wanted to. Often we've known that academics have used the scorecards to do research on it. Environmental consultants have used the scorecards to approach councils. We've known that different organisations have used the score, such as the Green Finance Institute, use the scorecards to look at councils' different commitments in their climate action plans, and therefore work with some of those councils to implement like green bonds. And so if you think there's a way for you to use the scorecards, then yeah, please go ahead and use them. They're there. They're open and free for use. So please go ahead and use them however you think you could.
Okay, great. Can you remind us how or where we can access these?
Yes, so it is on our website, councilclimatescorecards.uk, and I can chuck that in the live chat now. I should have had
Oh,
that link.
great. That'd be
No
helpful.
worries. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, councilclimatescorecards.uk, and from tomorrow the scores will be publicly available for anyone to use and look at.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Isaac. One last question will do. Let's see. How do you mitigate against the whataboutism that comes up every time someone mentions that we need fewer cars in cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is really, I think, yeah, that's a really good question.
It's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot. The thing is, there's a lot of good. That firstly, this is what the one of the most effective things of the scorecards is being able to show where councils are taking best practice action, and therefore real examples you can point to. Often, and I've seen it when I was living in Vancouver, and I've seen it when I'm in the councils across the UK, and individual campaign, and in this, people will go, "Oh no, we can't do this. What about this? What about that?" And if you can go, "Well, that council there has done it, and these are the impacts, and this is the effect it had, like the positive effect, this is potentially some of the negative effects it had, but the way to mitigate against those negative effects are X, Y, or Z." That's one of the most effective ways to convince councils. Kind of one of our kind of theories of change around the scorecards is that if you can show councils, like which councils are taking some of that best practice action, while also providing the accountability for those councils that aren't, residents, communities, councillors, officers can go, okay, like this is some of the most effective action we can take, and this council is doing it, and therefore we can kind of understand from that council taking that action, like what the impacts are, what we can do to mitigate any negative impacts. And so probably one of the most effective ways you can challenge that whataboutism is by looking at other councils, other areas that have taken similar action, and using that as a guide and as a basis to be like, this is the impact it's going to have, this is what we know is going to happen, and this is how we can mitigate any of the negative effects. And hopefully the scorecards can prove really useful for people to do that.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that they will. Very excited to use them myself on some of my projects, so
Cool.
that's great.
Thank you.
Okay, how much time do we have on this
I think
call?
there's only a couple of minutes, so maybe one really quick answer, but
One more?
yeah.
Okay. Hopefully this will be a good quick one. What alternative forms of financing do you recommend for councils to take in a period where financial provisions are becoming increasingly difficult? I know you
Yeah.
mentioned something about a community buying scheme that
Yes.
enables the solar panels to be a bit cheaper.
Yeah. So there'd be two things. So there's that way of driving forward change. So that's for residents that obviously do have the income to be able to afford new solar panels, but things like um, collective buying schemes that are run, even in my hometown of Luton across Bedfordshire, where they sent out information to people to be like to sign up to register, and then they have an auction, and the best people can the best prices then go forwards, and people can save money on institutions there, introducing renewable energy schemes there as well. One of the other ways is through green bonds, which is actually the Green Finance Institute would be the best people to look at, and it's one of the questions in our scorecards. Councils can actually raise money through going out there with a green bond where people can invest amounts of money and they get returns on the income, and the council uses that pot of funding to drive forward decarbonisation in their area. And I think I've just finished in time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we'll be moving on to the next talk shortly. But yes, just one big last thank you to you, Isaac. That was incredibly informative. And yeah, thanks for the excellent questions, guys.